Death. Death is a natural part of our lives, and as much as we fear it, we will need to face it someday, and that day is today. So let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, 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 and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I am your host, as always, Johnson Zen. And before we begin, as always, I just want to thank you all so much for your support. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe for more. Thanks. So I hope you all had a very spooky and fun-filled Halloween. And if you didn't get the chance to check out the last episode, I made a fun Halloween special for you all to enjoy. So please take a listen to that if you haven't had the chance. And now that Halloween is over, there's a new holiday that is celebrated by thousands of people around Latin America, specifically in Mexico. It's, as you may have guessed by the title of this episode, called The Day of the Dead, or Dia de Muertos. Sorry for my terrible Spanish, but generally this holiday is celebrated in Mexico as a way to honor and remember family and friends who have died. So in honor of that holiday, I wanted to talk a little bit about death and what it means to die. So I think in the US and in the West in general, death is something we don't like to talk about and is often considered as a taboo. We usually go out of our way to avoid talking about death, and it's evident in the vocabulary that we use to talk about death. We often use euphemisms like passed away or has moved on or in a better place now to inform people that someone is dead or has died. It's often considered rude or insensitive to say someone we know has died as opposed to saying someone we know has passed away. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using these euphemisms to describe death. I just wanted to use this as an example of one of the things we do to avoid talking directly about death. And with that said, I just want to give you some fair warning before I continue that today I will be discussing what it means for someone to die, and some of the things I'll be discussing may be considered taboo, and if that's not your cup of tea, I am generally sorry. You probably won't enjoy this episode, but please come back next week for a very interesting story. And for those of you who are still here, thank you, and you're all awesome. Now, let's talk about death. So the first question I want to ask is, what is death, and what does it mean to die? This may sound like a really easy question, but think about it. How do we know when someone has died? Some people may say, oh, it's when the heart stops beating. But there are cases, especially during the era of primitive medicine, that many people were buried alive because the medical examiner couldn't detect a pulse in that person. Others may say that death is when the brain stops functioning. While that's true for the majority of cases, but again, there are other cases where people are considered brain dead, but different parts of their body are still functioning. And for simplicity's sake, this is often considered a comatose state, or coma for short. So it is possible for someone to still be alive, technically, when their heart stops beating or if their brain dies. So if that's the case, when is a person truly considered to be dead? In the US, the medical definition of death is, quote, the irreversible cessation of all the following. Number 1, total cerebral function, usually assessed by EEG or electroencephalograph, as flatline. Number 2, spontaneous function of the respiratory system, And number three, spontaneous function of the circulatory system. So to summarize, if an EEG or electroencephalograph, which detects electrical signals in the brain, stops detecting brain signals, you're not breathing and your heart is not beating, then medically you're considered to be dead. The key word in this definition is irreversible. And take this with a grain of salt since I'm not a medical professional. But I think that if you are in a coma and your brain is dead, but you're still using a respirator to help pump oxygen to your body, you may still be considered alive, but I think you're medically considered dead at that point because without a respirator, you're unable to breathe on your own. Though, again, I'm not a medical professional, and if you are one, please correct me. So, anyways, that's the medical definition of death. And I think for the most part, that's the death that the majority of people are familiar with. But there's also a separate legal definition of death that some of us may not be familiar with since a lot of it is circumstantial. Again, in the US, the legal definition of death falls under two categories: the medical declaration, which is pretty much the same as the medical definition of death, and the other category is the presumption of death, or the declared death in absentia. Different countries have different legal definitions of what this means, but since I'm American, I will be talking about the US definition of presumed death. So, in the US, if you are a missing person, you can be declared legally dead if you meet several criteria. These may vary state by state, but for the most part, they are one, if you have been missing from your home or primary residence for an extended period of time. Usually, this is 7 years, but different states have different number of years depending on which state you are in. But usually, it's around 7 years. Number two, the absence must be continuous and inexplicable. So the person cannot say that, they found a new job and are moved away. That doesn't consider them to be absent. That doesn't consider them to be continuously absent just because they moved away. So number three, there must be no communication from the party with those people most likely to hear from them during the period the person has been missing. So if you're missing, you can't be talking with your family or you can't have any communication with anyone you know. And number four, there must be a diligent but unsuccessful search for the person or unsuccessful inquiry into their whereabouts. So if you're missing and no police report has been filed for your missing person, meaning that the police have never tried to search for you, then you can't be considered legally dead after 7 years. So those are the four criteria to be considered legally dead, or legally presumed dead. Let me give you an example of what it means to be presumed dead. So an example of this would be the American Airlines passengers on Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. So those passengers have been missing for an extended period of time, though it's not been quite 7 years. It is still an extended amount of time since they've been lost. Their absence is continual, meaning that they've been missing since their disappearance. Family and friends have not heard from them during that time of their absence. And there has been numerous unsuccessful searches for the plane and its passengers. So even though there is no physical body for a medical examiner to declare that these people are medically dead, legally, the US recognizes that these people are presumed to be dead. So their families, they can file for their death certificates and collect insurance for their loved ones. The only exception to this missing person rule is if you are in the military and you become MIA or missing in action. Unless your body is found, you will be considered MIA forever. There's no statute stating that after a certain amount of years that they will consider you to be deceased. There are a few stories of soldiers who were MIA coming back home after years of being missing. The military, they will continue to pay your salary to your family as if you were still alive unless your family legally files for your death certificate. In that case, you will still be considered MIA on the military record, but your family will stop receiving your salary. So, those are the legal definitions for what it means to be dead, at least in the US. I think for the most part, most people would agree with these legal definitions of what it means to be dead. Now, I want to switch things up a little bit and talk a little bit more subjectively about death and discuss death in a philosophical sense. And I'm going to preface this by saying that this is my own opinion, so feel free to let me know what you think about this subject. And with that said, let's get a little philosophical. So, what do I mean by a philosophical death? Well, this kind of goes back to the definition of death and what it means to die, and if we all are destined to die. This is kind of in the lines of ancient philosophers contemplating their mortality and whether or not it's possible to achieve immortality. These are the types of questions that philosophers have asked ever since the first human civilizations. If you were to ask me if it's possible to achieve immortality, I would say yes. So what do I mean by this? And if I can become immortal, how do I do that? Let me first warn you that it's not the immortality that you're probably thinking about. Again, this kind of harkens back to what you define death to be. To me, I think that there are three phases of death that one goes through before they are truly considered to be fully dead. So, the first phase of death, to me at least, is the biological death. This is the death that we're all familiar with. It's when your biological functions stop, and I would say it's synonymous with the definition of the medical definition of death. I don't think I really need to talk much more about this first phase since I already talked a lot about it earlier. So now we get much more philosophical about what it means to die. The second phase of death is your death from memory. And what I mean by this is that after your biological death, you still live on through the memories of the people that you knew when you were alive. During your lifetime, the people that you meet, your friends, family, coworkers, classmates, etc., one way or another, the mere action of interacting with these people has unknowingly intertwined your lives together. If you have any significance in these people's lives, or if they considered you to be a significant part of their life, then after your biological death, you will still be alive and live on and exist as a memory to these people. And it's not until the very last person who has any memory of you dies that you too will die by memory. So I know this may sound a little confusing, but hopefully I can explain it a little better with an example. So my grandmother on my dad's side, she passed away when I was a freshman in high school. Biologically, she's dead, but to me, she's still alive inside of me and the rest of my family who knew her. She's alive in all of us through our collective memories of her. My niece, who was born last year, She has no memory of who her great grandmother is. She may get to know her great grandmother through pictures or stories that we tell her, but my niece will never have any actual memories of meeting her great grandmother. Assuming I become the last surviving member of my family that has any memory of my grandmother, when I die biologically, then as the last person who had any memory of my grandmother while she was still alive, my death means that no one else alive will have any memory of her while she was still alive. I will be the last person that has ever interacted with her while she was still alive. This means that upon my biological death, my grandmother also dies by memory. Similarly, I'll survive in the memory of those who knew me, and I too will die by memory when the last person who knew me when I was alive dies. And this brings me to the last phase of death, and that is your historical death. So after our death from memory, we can still live on in history. Every day, whether consciously or unconsciously, directly or indirectly, we affect and influence the people around us. My niece, who has never met her great grandmother, as her mother, who is my cousin, tells her stories about her great grandmother and she gets to know her, my grandmother will continue to live inside my niece through this historical retelling of her story. And as long as she continues to pass down the stories about her great grandmother to her future children and future grandchildren, then my grandmother will be immortalized through these stories about her. And once these stories and history about her are forgotten, then my grandmother will have truly died. And when that time comes, there won't be a single human on earth who would have any idea about who she was or anything about her life story. My ancestors from the 1800s, I have no idea who they are, what their names are, and what they did, and most importantly, what their story is. And neither does anyone in my family know anything about our ancestors from the 1800s. And I think it's safe to say that no one alive in this planet today knows anything about who my ancestors were 200 years ago. And so, whoever they were, as of 2018, they are, to me, considered truly dead. And this brings me back to the point I made about the possibility of immortality. If you open up a history book, you'll know that there are millions of people who have lived in the past that we still know about their life stories today. These people are often considered as historical figures, and their stories live on because people are still telling the life stories of these people. We know the entire life story of Abraham Lincoln, who lived over 150 years ago, and his story and history lives on today. And all these people who have their stories immortalized by history never truly died because they're still alive in history. And as long as we keep telling their stories, they will never truly die. But for the majority of people, we'll probably never be immortalized by history. Even in today's information age, where data is stored by the millions of gigabytes, the reality is that most of us will probably be forgotten 200 years from now. Even if our entire life stories are uploaded online, it'll probably be lost in the trillions and trillions of terabytes of data 200 years from now. And unless we do something that will cement us into history, we are all bound to be forgotten eventually. And I know it may sound morbid and sad, but it's the truth. Out of the billions of humans that have lived all throughout human history, only a very small fraction of the total amount of humans that have ever lived are immortalized by history. I hate to end things on something so negative, so let's look on the bright side. Though 200 years from now, you may be considered truly dead, it's still possible, especially in today's information age, for you to be reborn. It's possible for you to return from the abyss of history, and someone 200 years from now, they could stumble upon an archive of your Twitter feed or YouTube vlog or Facebook post and learn your life story as you write it today. And with that said, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your moment of Zen. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya.